Station identification.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
Operating frequency
on ztalkradio.com.
Engage your brain and enter the mind's eye on Z-Talk Radio. And I'm your host, Brian Turnov, on this lovely day, October 14th, 2014. Tonight's guest is Jonathan Simon, a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. His book, Governing Through Crime, won the American Sociology Association's 2008 Sociology of Law Distinguished Book Award and the 2010 Hilling Prize of an American Society of Criminology. We'll discuss his latest, Mass Incarceration on Trial, a remarkable court decision and the future of prisons in America. For nearly 40 years, the United States has been gripped by policies that have placed more than 2.5 million Americans in jails and prisons designed to hold a fraction of that number of inmates. Our prisons are not only vast and overcrowded, they are degrading, relying on racist gangs, lockdowns, and Supermax-style segregation units to maintain a tenuous order. Mass Incarceration on Trial examines a series of landmark decisions about prison conditions, culminating in Brown v. Plata, decided in May 2011 by the U.S. Supreme Court. This set of rulings points toward values that could restore legitimate order to American prison systems and ultimately lead to the demise of mass incarceration. If the goal of a prison system is to prevent crime, provide justice, and rehabilitate offenders, how close have we come to that goal? Is our criminal justice system fair? How much does it cost to you, the average citizen, to operate the prison system? Answers to these questions and more with Professor of Law Jonathan Simon right after this short break.
We're scaring up a good time on your favorite radio station.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
Without further ado, let's welcome to the show Professor of Law Jonathan Simon. Big thank you to Jonathan for slicing us a piece of your time tonight on this edition of The Mind's Eye.
Oh, you're more than welcome to it.
The pleasure is all mine. And your focus of teaching and your previous publications like Poor Discipline and the highly acclaimed award-winning Governing Through Crime concentrate on the effects of prison system in America. And I don't really take you for a guy who has served some hard time, although I could be wrong. So I'm just wondering, where did this fervor for the American prison system originate?
It's true that I've never been a involuntary guest in a state prison institution. I've been in jail a couple of times for some of my early Berkeley student day protests, that some of your listeners may have as well. And indeed, it was around that time that the whole issue of how a democratic society locks people up that it is afraid of and that it has, legal charges against began to interest me as a law student and a student of American democracy. And that was really at the very beginnings of what we now call mass incarceration. At the time, I had no idea that the California prison population, which was then around 30,000 prisoners, would go to more than 180,000 prisoners before we were done with building the system that is what sort of took place during my watch. And while I can't say that I predicted it, I did my best to describe it as it developed. And in my latest book, I'm doing my best to see if I can view a path out for us.
And in preparation of the show, you're looking at. I was looking at statistics, and they're very startling and almost staggering in a sense of how much of America almost is. I believe they're the world's biggest jailer at this point. So I was definitely surprised by how many people are really behind prison. Not really at how bad the system is, but more about the numbers behind it. And for me, that was the most startling. And
that's true for a lot of us, Brian. I think as we came to this issue, we were first struck by the enormous scale. And I don't want to downplay scale. That tells us that something big has happened to American society. When you see, when we actually divide the imprisonment numbers over our population, we get a very interesting pattern, which is from the beginning of the 20th century and actually well into the 19th century to about 1975. A very steady pattern of about 100 prisoners per 100,000 people out in the free world. And then we begin mass incarceration in the 80s, and by the turn of the century, we've got 400 people in prison for every 100,000. Of course, that gets much scarier when we look at more specific populations. 1% of males, 10% of black males, 30% of black males in prison during their lifetime. Really staggering.
And what do you tell to the person who's saying to themselves right now, I don't commit any crimes, why should I really care about the laws and the conditions that revolve around people that, quote unquote are guilty and commit, some of them are pretty horrendous crimes?
Fair enough, and I think that's where one of our problems today is there's so many different issues to talk about around prisons. One is whether there are people in them that shouldn't be there. And that is a big issue. We focus on the war on drugs and things of that nature. But the question you're raising is one that I really am eager to get to in my book, which is, what do we owe to those people that we think should be in prison? And I try to make the case that once we decide who should be in prison, those are the people presumably who have done the most serious kinds of crime and who we have the most individual reason to believe that they're going to continue to be a threat to their community. I think it's really important to ask ourselves, what do we owe them? And when I do that, and I talk to other audiences about it, I think we have a remarkable amount of agreement in this country that we actually want a decent prison system. That is one that respects people's human dignity. Despite what people may write on internet, blog or newspaper comment sections that often would indicate a comfort level with torture and degrading treatment, I think when you get Americans actually talking about what they want out of the justice system, they're pretty appalled by the idea that people might face torturous-like prison conditions. After all, if you're in prison to be punished by being removed from the community and compelled to really regret what you've done, that's not likely to happen if what you're suffering from is untreated schizophrenia or HIV. You're likely, if you're conscious at all, to be just resentful that you're being abused, and you're not likely to see this as a legal act of retribution for your wrongdoing. So I really think victims, and also we who are the citizens of the state who authorize its public power to punish, really have a great stake in making sure that that punishment doesn't trample on human dignity.
Yeah, there's a lot of ethical issues here, and I think the way that a society treats their prisoners is a reflection on the values and the principles of that society itself. And I think our current prison system essentially reflects our values that we've grown up with and that we are at this point. And would you say that this new book, Mass Incarceration on Trial, is almost a sequel to your last book, Governing Through Crime, or just the natural continuation of that?
Well, it is in a way. I mean, in Governing Through Crime, I was really trying to understand the political forces behind mass incarceration, because I do think it's very easy to see mass incarceration when we observe just how many interest groups there are that benefit from it, the various political agendas that have essentially aligned themselves with it, to see it as largely a political, economic institution, which it of course is in some ways, but that misses the fact that it's also a moral institution. It's not sold to Americans as a way to, keep white working class people in good paying jobs or reverse the gains of the civil rights movement. It's offered to people as a way to keep innocent people safe from the guilty. And I think we have to take those claims seriously, and when the prison system fails those claims, which it really has in California, and I would put it to you, has in many states across the country, then we have to call it to account, not for what we might sociologically accuse it of doing, but for what it actually claims to be doing in the form of criminal justice.
And you just talked about the California prison system, and in your book, it becomes almost the quintessential prison, and the perfect example of what are the major flaws going on right now. And can you go into explain a little bit some of the biggest flaws that you currently see with our prison system?
Well, I think California really is a kind of a good example of sort of what's deeply wrong with mass incarceration. Partly because California is a state, and California's correctional history as a history, is part of the American experience that we expect to produce things we're proud of, not things we're ashamed of, right? So we have a long history of terrible prisons, but they've usually been related to parts of the country that are economically backwards, that have tremendously unresolved racial discrimination issues. I'm thinking of the Confederacy, Deep South. That's the places where courts found abominable prison conditions back in the 60s and 70s. It's striking to see these kinds of prison conditions arise in a state like California, which is known to the world as a place of culture, education, high technology, democratic values. So what did we do here? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, we had a relatively small prison system that had the goal of rehabilitating people, often in naive ways, with things like bibliotherapy and the hopes that trying a little psychology on people with a lot of social problems would make their crime issues go away. But it was a system fairly committed to treating people as human beings. Of course, it made all kinds of individual errors. But as a system, we know that it did relatively well in terms of recidivism, and it kept itself relatively small and relatively humane. Beginning in the 1980s, we kind of threw that out the door. We decided that rehabilitation didn't work, and that the only thing that would really keep us safe was keeping as many potential criminals as possible locked up. And that committed us to a policy of what I call total incapacitation. Keep as many people locked up for as long as possible, regardless of their individual circumstances, regardless of the individual risk they pose. And when you do that, if you run that experiment, one of the things that happens is you end up accumulating a population of people who have a great deal of problems, not necessarily criminal problems, but often health problems. They're drug users who have accumulated chronic illnesses like hepatitis C, HIV, or cancer. They've developed mental illnesses through years of living on the street or in and out of prison. And then we concentrated those people in prisons that were actually designed to produce just custody, no individualized inspection, treatment, etc. That kind of formed a perfect storm, I would say, to create deeply inhumane conditions. And when you then add in factors like the state having real fiscal problems, beginning with the dot-com bust back around the turn of the century, what you get is this kind of massive overcrowding that finally drew the Supreme Court's attention. And believe me, it takes a lot to get the Supreme Court to call you barbaric. That's what the Supreme Court did in Brown versus Plata.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and I want to save that decision just for a few more minutes. And the American people are paying for these prisons, essentially, and the jails are consuming a huge portion of our $200 billion to spend annually on public safety. And how much, it's kind of like a two-part question, essentially. The first part, I'm not really sure if you know, but how much does the average tax-paying citizen pay to upkeep this system? And if the goal, like you said before, of a criminal justice and prison system is to prevent crime, be fair, just rehabilitate offenders, how close do you think we are to coming to the people, the taxpayers, getting their money's worth?
Well, it's, one way to think about our expenditure is to compare it to other things that the state spends money on. And there, some people may be surprised to realize it's not nearly as big as the amount of money we spend, say, on K-12 education. But of course, that touches every family in the state. It's not as much as we spend on health care, especially with the expansions under Obamacare, something I want to come back to because it has a lot of implications for people in the system today. But it is very equivalent in many states to the amount of money we're spending on higher education. And of course, higher education for much of my lifetime was where states invested their hopes, their hopes for their population achieving, better jobs, technology breakthroughs, and the kind of things that California in many ways exemplified during the 20th century. But unfortunately, that money is now being invested in incarceration, and most of our state schools, state university systems have been frozen and seeing more and more of their costs shifted onto individual students. So that's one way that taxpayers experience it. Now, let's be realists. My point is that many of the people that we've now gathered in our prisons have chronic illnesses, have mental illnesses, need a lot of social services, and need a lot of help, it's not really going to be, at the end of the day, taxpayers are going to have to probably pony up money to address these social problems, either in the form of health subsidies, in the form of welfare and housing subsidies, or in the form of incarceration. And my point would be, compared to those other ways of spending the money, we're getting a really bad deal out of incarceration. One, because many of these people just don't pose the kind of crime risk that we've assumed, especially when we've taken into account the fact that we kind of forgot about human aging. That is, we've given people 30, 40, 50-year sentences that assume that somebody who's an active robber at 26 is going to feel the same way at 56. And believe me, at 55, I can tell you it ain't that way. Life course changes all of us. And so we're investing in incarcerating people whose crime risk is going down as they age, and whose health care needs and costs are going up astronomically. So, over the years we've been told that the average cost is about $40,000 per prisoner. But when you look at a prisoner who's maybe in their 50s and that's considered geriatric for prisoners and needs that kind of health care, you're talking more about 70, 80, 90, 100,000 a year. So what we really need to do is get a lot smarter about how we use prison sentences and stop pulling on to people during these years when they're really not much of a threat, but they really are a huge cost. And, of course, they're bearing the brunt of the suffering as well.
Yeah, hopefully we can get smarter on so many other issues, hopefully a little bit quicker on this one. And I think it's important not to forget about the human element of it before we go into the Supreme Court decision a bit more. And in your experience, in your research, what is really the daily life like for an inmate?
I think the overwhelming reality is boredom and sort of small-scale misery. I mean, if you look at California, we had prisons operating at 200 to 300% of capacity. And the state often poo-poos that as if that's not a very big deal. But I think you start with the premise that in the history of modern corrections, you generally didn't want to operate a prison anywhere near 100% capacity. Because a prison with 100% capacity, you got every cell full. It doesn't have any room for emergencies to develop, problems to develop. No, every staff member is basically doing the maximum amount they can do to keep it to operate. If you move to 200%, you're really creating a situation where you can only manage that prison on a sort of governing by emergency basis. And in fact, many of our prisons during that period, and this really lasted about 20 years, operated on a lockdown basis. Every other day they were locked down, which meant that even if you were in the general population and had the theoretical possibility of attending education programs, work opportunities, etc., you couldn't actually go to those because everyone was locked down in their cell just to manage that. So ironically, you probably heard about our security housing units where we locked prisoners away 23 hours a day, no programming, no interaction. That we actually extended that to a very large plurality of our prison population just by the sheer brunt of overcrowding. Another piece of it is I asked in San Francisco, we've got a new clinic, a health clinic aimed at addressing people coming back from prison and their distinctive health problems. And I asked him, what's the biggest problem you're facing? And he said morbid obesity. That tells you something about how people end up being confined, not getting a chance to move around or interact. This is not the world of people working on their bodies in a perfect gym.
I know they have that image in the movies that they're all just working out all day, every day.
Yeah, and that has certain appeal. And ironically, even Justice Scalia kind of made that kind of claim, played that card in the Plata case when he said that this decision would lead to all these gym-hardened bodies on the streets of California. He apparently ignored the whole record that showed that those gyms were filled with bunk beds, housing prisoners, just to keep them out of the cold and rain.
Wow. Since you brought that up, that's something that I actually find very shocking, obviously because of the way that the media portrays those who are in prison. And I guess that brings up another question. What are the other flaws that you see in the media and how they portray being a prison and maybe even just the prison conditions in general? What are the discrepancies that you see there?
Yeah, in recovery right now, and really I see a lot of change in the media. Historically, we've seen different phases. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of media attention to prison conditions. During, the 1980s, as attitudes in the public hardened about crime and the whole issue of crack cocaine, violent crime seemed to dominate the imagination, the media really returned to its historic roots as a crime sheet, basically. It bleeds, it leads mantra seemed to dominate a great deal of our media. And typically, when you got story that dealt with prison or punishment, it really only dealt with it through the filter of this person who did this horrible crime being sent to this prison sentence. Never really dealt with what they were like once they got into prison, how they were treated, and we've seen relatively little of that. I mean, people have seen shows like Orange is the New Black, but I think the media has made a turn, and I think Brown versus Plata deserves some of the credit, because I think 2011 is kind of the turning point. I'm meeting more and more journalists that actually are studying mass incarceration or reporting on mass incarceration as a kind of story, rather than just the traditional crime reporter. But it's hard to lose old habits, and we know that, crime stories sell, and I see even some of our best newspapers kind of returning to the crime story whenever anything happens that kind of remotely fits it. So I think we have to, there's a real time of change, and I think those people who are working in the media, have a real opportunity right now to kind of carve out a new approach that will be more encompassing of the kind of information they're presenting to the public.
Very interesting. And we're about to talk about Brown versus Plata, and that's going to be probably really the focus for the rest of the show. But before we get into that, I was just wondering if somebody has to be profiting off of this, in a sense, the mass incarceration, because the American people are clearly not profiting off of it or getting what they pay for. The victims of prisons, nobody's paying there. Somebody has to be profiting off this. Have you noticed anything in that respect?
So I think it's important, I think, to reflect on two things. One, that something as big as mass incarceration is going to generate enormous economic and political benefits, as well as costs, right?
Exactly.
And that would have been true even if we had decided in the 1970s to have a war on failed education, and we had spent billions of dollars expanding, schools and universities, which would have certainly floated my boat as an academic. It will also have created something like a higher education industrial complex full of, companies and interest groups seeking to serve that need. So I don't think we should be surprised that there are a lot of interests that have become quite comfortable with and indeed dependent on mass incarceration. And I think some of the most important include our prosecutors, who have traditionally been only kind of the stepping stone office to political office, but in the era of governing through crime, they have become very politically influential and have had a lot of influence on other political leaders. They enjoy a tremendous amount of power because of mass incarceration, because of all these sentencing laws that allow people to be sent to prison for relatively trivial offenses. That gives them enormous power to force people to plea bargain, for instance. And I think one of the strongest sources of resistance we see is from prosecutors who don't want to give up that power. Correctional officers in many states have benefited, at least superficially, from demand for their jobs, increases in their pay. But I actually think it's really important to see that, especially correctional officers who, unlike prosecutors, have to walk the streets of our prisons, they live in our prisons as workers, that really degrading conditions, such as we created in California, actually also degrade the prison worker in a way that I think ultimately has affected them, and I don't view them as really beneficiaries of the system in that sense, even though some of them may believe they have been. So I think it's terribly important for us to, recognize those interests, recognize that they may provide or prevent, reform from happening as easily as we would like. But at the end of the day, as I said before, I think mass incarceration ultimately stands not on who it feeds, but on who it claims to serve in the way of protecting them from violence. And those are the grounds that I think we should take it on and just demonstrate that it's not so. It's not delivering the goods that it says it is, and it's creating costs that are really out of line, not just with our pocketbook, but with our values.
And for those just joining the conversation here on The Mind's Eye, we're talking with Professor of Law Jonathan Simon about the American prison system and his book, Mass Incarceration on Trial. And let's get into Brown versus Plata. I know I've been avoiding it as much as possible, but it seems that the tide has turned with this decision. So can you go into the effects of what this ruling was and how it affects the average person as well?
Sure. And I understand the reluctance to get too lost in the weeds of law, because it can be both boring and distracting. But I think this case has some counteracting aspects. One is the numbers. So just reflect on the fact that this is the largest prison population reduction that's ever been ordered in world history. Now, that's probably because we're the largest prison system in world history. I mean, California, at the time that Plata came down, and no other state has really tried to put this level of its population in prison, and so we're in new territory here. But no less an authority than Justice Scalia, in dissent, called it, quote, the most radical prison injunction in our nation's history. And I agree with it. This was radical. I mean, California had fewer than 40,000 prisoners total when I was a graduate student here writing, the dissertation that became Poor Discipline in the 1980s. And they were ordered to reduce their prison population by that much in Brown versus Plata. So just on the numbers alone, this is a big decision. If you've been following some of the coverage of the national prison population, the story over the last 2 years was that America's trend had changed, and after decades of prison growth, we were now beginning a prison population decline. Most of that national decline came from Plata. So just on the numbers, this was sort of a big decision. The second aspect of that, maybe I'll get to three, is that by taking 40,000 people who would have gone to prison and effectively ordering California to find some other way to deal with them, mostly through probation and very short jail terms, we've had essentially an involuntary experiment in whether mass incarceration was needed to begin with. That is, do we really benefit from a crime prevention point of view from indiscriminately putting felons in prison? And the Supreme Court essentially ordered California to test that proposition in an experiment, and we're 3 years into the experiment, and guess what? There's no crime wave here in California. So that's kind of the numbers and the instrumental story. I think for those of us that are a little bit more interested in the role that legal doctrine plays, this case also stood out for the strength with which a majority of the court, only 5 votes, but 5 out of 9 is a majority, according to my math, took the strongest stand that any Supreme Court in U.S. history has ever taken in defining sort of the scope of what I would call human rights protection for prisoners. So the main constitutional vehicle to protect prisoners in our Constitution is the Eighth Amendment, which forbids, quote, cruel and unusual punishment. Many justices and many times the court has acted as if that meant basically you can't be tortured in a kind of deliberate way. Mm-hmm. If they're going to kill you, they have to kill you quick. They can't deliberately make it a prolonged bad experience, and prison can't turn into a kind of a torture chamber. That's an important right, but it's a limited one. Brown versus Plata went a lot further. It said that protection of human dignity was actually the central value of the Eighth Amendment and animates that amendment. And the protection of human dignity, I think, is something that can have a lot of implications for our, not just our prison system, but our criminal justice system more broadly. Because whether you're looking at stop and frisk in the streets to people who aren't even convicted of a crime yet, or the discrimination that former prisoners face in getting into all kinds of occupations and housing opportunities, etc. These are things that really challenge human dignity as that's been understood globally in a human rights framework. So we're not there yet, but I think Brown versus Plata puts us on a course where we could see a substantial increase in human rights protections for prisoners, which we've not historically had in this country. We treated the Constitution as kind of the end and the beginning of our legal obligation to prisoners.
Well, and this was 40 years in the making, essentially, of the legislation that came before it. Was there a certain event that had them change, or because why would this sudden shift in philosophy, essentially? What marked this?
That's a very good question. And I think when we're talking about the Supreme Court, we're talking about 9 human beings. So we can kind of think about how individuals change. Justice Kennedy, who's our sort of swing justice on this issue and on many issues, seems to have been concerned about this for a while. First of all, he's a Californian. He's from California, and he served on the bench and then on the federal bench for the Ninth Circuit, covering California and Western states for many years. In 2003, he spoke to the American Bar Association out in California, and he specifically referenced prison conditions in his speech there and warned that he thought California's prison conditions were sort of verging on the truly troubling. So I think he's been personally troubled for a long time. He's also the justice that is in some ways the most influenced by global ideas about human rights. He spends a lot of time in Europe talking to European jurists, and he seems to be a little more embarrassed than some of his brethren and sisters on the U.S. High Court as to how far out of line America now is with most of its sort of democratic peers in the world in terms of our death penalty, in terms of our use of imprisonment. So I think his evolution has been an important part of this. But I think we also have to look at the broader social situation. In the 1970s and 80s, when the Supreme Court began to sort of retreat from protecting human rights and began to sort of assert the idea that, you know, criminals are so dangerous that we really can't afford to extend human rights to prisoners, crime was up. The American public was incredibly politically agitated about crime. We had several presidential elections that turned on concern about crime, 1968 and then 1988 when George H.W. Bush sort of won unexpectedly because of his support for the death penalty. And then in the 90s, we had elections that really turned on crime. So I think that this court tends to follow the election returns in a distant sort of way. Today, we're in a very different situation. While people like myself who are baby boomers may still think that the homicide rate is what it was in 1989, it really isn't. We've had a dramatic crime decline over the last 20 years. And younger Americans whose influence is going to be felt more and more as we go forward, so-called millennials, I don't think share that kind of high noon attitude about crime that many baby boomers and Generation Xers do. So I think the courts feel a little safer protecting human rights, and that's a nice combination. You tend to get the most advancement in legal rights when courts see the problem and also feel that they won't be walloped by the voters.
You just brought up a really good point. For me, it's hard to understand how you just said two exact opposite things, essentially, that we know that the prison system, the population skyrocketed, and at the same time, violent crimes were going down. So it's hard for me to fathom, because I was still young at the time, I wasn't voting on this type of legislation, how this really happened if those two contradictory statistics really existed. How did it go for so long, essentially?
I try to develop this in the book in Chapter 2, that Americans really kind of, in the 70s, I think, found ourselves, not for strange reasons, for understandable reasons, coming to accept a very extreme sort of philosophy about crime. Again, we had a very high homicide rate, violent crime rate generally. It had basically tripled, as I said, by the time I was in college from the time I was born. Most of the best social science said that there was very little that prison rehabilitation or policing could do about it. And so I think many Americans felt that, you know, we're surrounded by Charles Mansons. The only thing we can do about them is try to lock them up for as long as possible. And the fact that when people got out of prison, they often had a high recidivism rate and returned to prison just confirmed our belief that, after all, they're incredibly dangerous, and the only question is how long can we hold them? I think those were very wrong ideas, but they were understandable ideas. Today, we have a very different picture, right? We much lower crime. The evidence strongly suggests that it's not imprisonment that produces the best drops in crime, but effective use of policing, as well as, you know, changes in the community, where communities themselves decide they've had enough of drugs or interpersonal violence. We haven't really studied that enough as criminologists. We tend to want to credit one side of the state or the other. But very little evidence now supports the proposition that incarcerating people is a good strategy for reducing especially violent crime long term. States like California show that, because we did a lot of incarcerating and we really had a less impressive decline in crime than many states like New York that took the opposite route.
And the public opinion when Brown versus Plata, the ruling came down, it seemed that most people really didn't agree with essentially, in their mind, people were saying, hey, they're going to let prisoners go out free, or that in their mind, that's maybe what they're saying. Has the public opinion changed at all since that time, or is it essentially the same?
So I think it's complicated to poll on this issue, because certainly Brown versus Plata would be understood by most of the public and was portrayed by the media and the dissenters on the Supreme Court as basically releasing a lot of prisoners early. And that whole philosophy of total incapacitation I was talking about, you know, tells you that if prisoners are coming out early, that's bad news. That means less safety, more violence, etc. Wrong-headed, but understandable conclusion. What I think really reassuring to me is that while people still don't know much about Brown versus Plata and may or may not have a particular opinion on it, there's quite a bit of polling around the various ballot initiatives in California that show that Californians are ready to vote for and have voted for and are ready to vote for more of, you know, measures to actually reduce the scope of imprisonment. They voted for 3 strikes reform in 2012, and right now we have something called Proposition 47 in front of us this November that will take a range of sort of minor felonies that have been at the sort of border between misdemeanors and felonies and make them 100% misdemeanors, therefore taking away the prosecution's power to send people to prison, or later to give people third strikes and second strikes based on that. So these are measures that would modestly reduce punitiveness, and they've won comfortably. And in fact, many pollsters now believe that these measures are too cautious, that the public actually is ready for much bolder steps to make our system more in line with our values. Now, again, if the murder rate was twice what it is today, that might not be true. I'm not saying it's just because we have the conscience of angels, but I am saying that I think it's wrong to assume that Americans are inherently punitive. I think Americans panicked in the 70s, accepted a degrading prison approach as sort of like we did the Cheney approach after 9/11 as a kind of dire necessity. And now that we see that was not a necessity, I think most of us would support substantial changes.
Yeah, the tide definitely seems to have turned, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to get your opinion on where you think we should go, but before you talked about how Obamacare has had a certain effect, I guess maybe on this, with this decision and on prison life. Go into that a little more.
Well, we're just at the beginning of this, but I think when we look at this period 10 or 20 years from now, we're going to think that the most important features of the Obama administration were, one, the health care thing, which is the biggest expansion of our social safety net in over half a century, and two, the President and the Attorney General signals that the war on crime needed to be winded down, especially the crack cocaine sentencing issue, their stance on the Ferguson issue. Those two together, I think, tell me that where the future is for both political parties and policymaking is in addressing the rising problem of chronic illness, and that we're really shifting as a nation from obsessing about crime, which was a big problem in the 70s and 80s, that hasn't been for a while, to issues like, the fact that we have a lot of chronic illness among our poor population, and because we don't have adequate health care for them, we're not well positioned to try to minimize the cost and the suffering caused by that chronic illness. When you put things in those terms, prisons start to look a lot different. They're accumulating some of the people with the worst kind of chronic illness vulnerability, and we're putting them in places that make their conditions much worse. Now, if we have to pay for their health care, whether they're in prison or out of prison, it becomes a really sensible thing to do to try to use the money we're now using to incarcerate people to get people into sustainable lifestyles aimed at addressing lifelong chronic illness problems. I mean, once you have hepatitis C, you're going to have that for much of your life, unless you get, the new drug, which costs about $90,000 a course, right? So, we used to think about mass incarceration in terms of the economic marginality of people who were ending up in prison. In other words, the story was, here's all these people that used to have a role in our economy. Now, because of the industrialization and the shifting of jobs overseas, there's persistent unemployment in this population, and mass incarceration has become kind of the way to manage this population that has no real economic role. Once people have access to health care, they actually do have we have an economic stake in them. That is, we're going to have to pay the cost of their health care across the lifetime. And if we leave them impoverished in degrading conditions, those costs are actually going to go up. So I think for the first time we have real economic incentives to try to give people, a more dignified and more appropriate sort of a response to the problems that they're facing. If we decide to deal with somebody's, mental illness by throwing them into jail, we're kind of hitting ourselves in the head, because we're going to have to pay for that person's costs across the life course.
So where do you think is the next logical step? If Brown versus Plata was the tide that started turning, where should we go next, legislatively speaking, and in any other type of reformation that you can think of with the prison system?
So I agree. I like your call for, focusing on the legislative side as well, because I do think that that's the law. The courts are going to be important because they can address the most marginal people in our society who don't have much political clout in a way that few other institutions can. So I do think we need more lawsuits just like Brown versus Plata. It's not like California had the worst prison. We just had the best prisoner lawyers that were willing to fight the hardest and the longest. But we need that fight across the country. But then we also need people in those states to kind of take stock of what's been done in their name and say, we want to change. I mean, that could take a lot of forms. Here in California, it might take the form of a constitutional amendment to require that the prison population never go above a level that causes inhumane conditions, and that forces the state to choose, what kinds of crimes it wants to punish with what sentences in order to achieve ultimately a humane and constitutional prison system. That would be one approach. We could amend our constitutions to make a promise against degrading treatment and not just cruel and unusual treatment explicit. It's already implicit in our Eighth Amendment, but that language is used in modern human rights charters like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Charter of Human Rights. It's somewhat broader. I think if we try to amend our constitutions to reflect that, future generations would recognize that as evidence that we had seen the wrongness of our ways. I mean, one of the things we're talking about now is history, not just what happens now, but what's going to happen 50 or 100 years from now. Will we be able to learn the lessons of mass incarceration, or will we find ourselves repeating it again and again and again? And I think bringing it to this kind of human rights constitutional dimension, even if it doesn't achieve constitutional changes, kind of pull our politics in the direction of addressing the significance of the wrong that has happened here.
Yeah, and it'll start a conversation, and that's really where changes begin with just having another conversation about a topic such as this. And I want to get your thoughts, because it seems that privatization of the prison system seems to be a really popular, obviously controversial strategy to improve the system. Where do you fall with the privatization of prison systems?
So first, note the fact that the public prison system has done a terrible job. So to the extent that we want to blame all of our problems on sort of a ruthless profit orientation, I think when it comes to prison inhumanity, that's certainly not the whole story. A lot of the story is public fear and indifference, and we have to take responsibility for that, not blame just the private sector. But you're right. Now it's ironic that the private sector is sometimes being offered as a solution. And again, I think if we frame things correctly, if the issue is how can we get care delivered to people who belong to an extremely vulnerable class, then I think a whole, looking to private and voluntary sectors, and especially involving the formerly incarcerated themselves in trying to remediate some of the impact on both individuals and communities of mass incarceration, is a really good idea. But if we're talking about prisons and jails, the future of incarceration, I'm very reluctant to see states push that into a kind of contract outsource sort of model, mostly because I think after this experience, we need more responsibility for what we're doing in prisons, not less. Now, again, the private sector is going to have a role there. I'd like to see our jails, which are our local institutions of incarceration, become much more central to how we address a whole range of incarceration needs. And it would make a lot of sense for jails to, basically feed people into community-based alternatives that will help keep them from ending up back in either jails or emergency rooms. But that begins as a public responsibility, and I want to make sure that public stamp is very clearly on it. That's what led the Israeli Supreme Court a few years ago to reject privatization of prisons, even on the hypothetical possibility that they might produce better rehabilitation than public ones, because the public responsibility for undertaking punishment is really at the core of what makes it a legitimate exercise of power.
I couldn't agree more with you there. I think it's particularly in the last 5 to 7 years we've seen that large corporations aren't exactly these benevolent businesses. Given the chance, most likely they'll take the cheap and most degrading way out, and we can go through a million examples right now, which obviously we're not going to. So I agree with you there. Plus, studies show that there's a lot of ethical issues when it comes to privatization of you're imprisoning a human being, so that becomes a business itself. So I'm definitely right there with you. Let's say the government says, we're going to hand you the keys, Jonathan Simon. Create the most and the best rehabilitative and punishment system. What would you do?
Well, I would notice, first of all, I'd be a little cautious at embracing rehabilitation as we did in the 50s, 60s as a reason to incarcerate people. I don't think that we have particularly great tools for rehabilitating people, especially when we lock them up, and to the extent that we can rehabilitate them, we usually have a better shot if we're doing it in the community. So I think we ought to recognize that if we're concerned about education, rehabilitation in prison, it's mainly to make sure that prisons themselves don't become degrading. I mean, we know from the Stanford prison experiment 30 years ago that when you put perfectly people from perfectly privileged backgrounds, into a prison as randomly selected guards and prisoners, they very quickly degenerate into dehumanizing and degrading treatment of each other just because of the basic game of what the prison is as a kind of teams that capture the flag sort of enterprise where the stakes are so high. And so we know that if you're going to prevent prisons from becoming degrading, you need to make them individualized. You need to make the individual circumstances a focus of everybody's attention. So again, I think we ought to embrace rehabilitation mainly as a way to prevent prison and jail from becoming degrading. What should we do in terms of prison and jail? I think the main thing to think about is reducing. I mean, I study the history of punishment. We used to punish serious crime by taking people on a scaffold and cutting them up.
Yeah.
It took a century or more to convince sort of the public that locking them in a cell was also a way of expressing our, severe judgment about their misbehavior. Today, that's what people associate serious punishment with, is confinement. But our problem is that we confine people for ridiculous lengths of time, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who might need to be sent to prison or jail for a while to show that we take seriously what happened to the victim and absolutely reject the behavior of the person. But we don't have to put them in prison for years and decades. I would say, if you look around the world, 10 or 15 years in prison is kind of on the long side for, that's there for very serious crimes like murder, rape, kidnapping, etc. When we're in the business of handing out 20 and 30-year sentences to burglars, something has gone badly off the rails. So what I would like to see happen is kind of a homeopathic approach to prison. Where we're handing out 10 years now, let's hand out 1 year. Where we're handing out a year, let's hand out a month. That can have the effect of, showing the person that we're not going to tolerate a continuation of their behavior. It shows the victim that we're not ignoring the violation of their dignity that a serious crime represents. But it would not commit us to, a degrading situation that we know is going to be hard on our state workers and really counterproductive in terms of the citizens that we're turning out.
And to me, just coming from the conversation that we've just had, you sound hopeful about the future of the prison systems. Would you agree with that?
I am, and I don't know if it's because when you're 55, you just start getting more hopeful.
I thought it was the opposite way, actually.
Or maybe it's because California has an enlightened policy on marijuana. I don't know. I'm in a hopeful mood, but it depends on people really seeing that their values have been betrayed and demanding accountability. And I think that does happen historically. We saw it after the Civil War in this country. We saw it briefly after World War II when there was a tremendous surge of interest in dignity and regret about the treatment of Japanese Americans during that war. So I'm one of those people who thinks that when Americans actually see what has been done in their name, that they're often capable of acting very rapidly. And I'm so impressed with the young people I see here at Berkeley and all over the country that I'm putting my bet in this new generation. And my slogan is basically, when it comes to crime control, don't trust anybody over 40.
I'm right there with you. And on this program, when we discuss these type of serious issues, at the end we always try to give the listeners a suggestion on how to follow up and how to become active. How would a listener who wants to get involved with this issue, what would you recommend?
Well, this is a great time because in almost every state there are human rights organizations like the ACLU, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the lawyers that often are working with them, bringing lawsuits about prison conditions. And it's very important for citizens to make their voices heard on that, to let local politicians and elected leaders, like especially governors, know that you would like them to seek humane conditions in prisons as rapidly as possible. We are also seeing a real rise in volunteers getting involved directly with our prison system. And one of the features of mass incarceration is there's a lot more prisons in America. So one of the first things people can do is find out what are the prisons and jails in their area, what are their profiles, how are people being treated. Because one of the worst parts of prison and jail is that it removes human beings from the visual and moral sort of inspection of other human beings. And we know from history that we rely a lot on what we can see for what we deem to be the moral nature of our society. One of the things the Nazis did very effectively was remove victims from the public before they really started victimizing them.
You're going to kill me for this next question, especially since mass incarceration just came out a few months ago. But do you have any ideas for the next book? And what can we expect there?
Well, Thank you for asking that question, because I'm really interested in this idea of dignity. Some people think that it is something that Americans have kind of lacked altogether as a value, partly because we never had the long process of digesting the aristocracy in the way that Europeans did, because dignity as a human rights idea in many ways is a kind of democratization of an aristocratic mode of treating people as deserving care and sympathy, etc. And of course we have the terrible problem of slavery, which kept us embracing a form of status that was negative rather than positive. We didn't have aristocrats, but we had sub people basically in slavery, and we've kept that. But I think I'm an optimist, as we discussed, and I think dignity is one of those values that's really rising in America right now. You see it in the Occupy movement and in tens of thousands of young people who want better alternatives than just being in debt from their college education. You see it in the same-sex marriage movement, which has swept barriers in front of it. So I think this idea of dignity is really building in America. And I'm going to write a book that tries to map out how that can help us rethink our criminal justice system.
Wonderful, and we'll definitely have to have you on to talk about that. And it really is a breath of fresh air for someone in your position to be talking about the generation coming up in such a way. A lot of times you hear such a negative connotation put over them and when talking about them, and it really is just a breath of fresh air to hear you talk about them in such a positive outlook. So kudos to you in that respect. And I know we only have a couple minutes left, but so I want to make sure that you get a few of your plugs out, and you got a great blog, and so share your social media sites and for the listeners that want to follow up.
You can follow me on Twitter at Jonathan Simon 59. That was the year I was born, when the homicide rate started to rise so precipitously. And you can check out my blog. If you just put in your search engine the phrase "governing through crime," you'll come up with my blog. And please let me know what you think about the book. My email is easy to find at the Berkeley Law School. I'm jsimon@law.berkeley.edu, or just put my name in a search engine.
It has been an absolute pleasure to have you here tonight. Jonathan Simon, professor of law, talking about his book, Mass Incarceration on Trial. Thank you so much for giving us a piece of your time tonight, and have a wonderful evening, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks so much, Brian. You take care.
You too. We'll be in touch. If you missed any part of the interview or want to see the upcoming schedule, go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. You'll get news, videos, archives, and so much more. mindseyemedia.com. And don't forget to check out our brand spanking new Facebook page, facebook.com/mindseyeshow. Join us again on the next live edition of The Mind's Eye for our first annual JFK Assassination Anniversary Special. I'm so excited to bring guest Ed Souza, former LA cop, professor of criminal justice, and we'll be talking about his book, Undeniable Truth, the clear and simple facts surrounding the murder of President JFK. All that and more on the next one. I can't wait. But it's time to shut the door and close the books on this edition. I'm your host, Brian Turnoff, on behalf of The Mind's Eye. This is Z Talk Radio.
Station identification.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network
Operating frequency.
on ztalkradio.com.